Hi, I'm Joe Dalton and welcome to Breakthrough Brands, the show that tells how Ireland's entrepreneurial DNA is rebooting the country one successful startup at a time. In this series, we'll demystify the process of starting up your own enterprise and growing it into a successful business by sharing the inspirational, educational, real-life experience of ordinary Irish business people. We talk to entrepreneurs who have taken control of their own destiny by doing what they love.
Good afternoon, Patrick Daly standing in again for your regular host Joe Dalton, and picking up on the international theme from some of the previous interviews that I've done. Today we're joined on the line from northern Spain by Eddie Lawton, the founder and president of Lawton School in the city of Gijon in Spain. Welcome, Eddie. Thanks for coming on to speak to us today.
Good afternoon, Patrick. I hope the weather's treating you well in Ireland.
It's not too bad. It's bright, cold and bright. So you know, it's good, all good.
Yeah, so it's improved a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to just going to tell listeners a little bit about you, Eddie, before we dive into it. So you're a native of Manchester in the United Kingdom.
That's
you're
right,
married to an Irish woman. You're a linguist, a businessman, and an expert on the learning and teaching of modern languages to many different nationalities.
I'm more of a linguist than a businessman.
Okay. And you have bachelor's and master's degrees in foreign languages from Cambridge University. You're the author of 2 books specifically for Spanish-speaking learners of English.
Right.
And you've designed and promoted many EU projects on language learning. And if that wasn't enough, you're a fluent speaker of Spanish, French and German. You're competent in Italian, Romanian and Portuguese, and you've some knowledge of Dutch and Catalan. Does that just about sum it up?
That's it. I don't know if I mentioned Romanian as well.
Yeah, Romanian's in there, yeah.
Oh, okay.
So firstly then, just to help listeners situate where you are, where in Spain is Gijon?
Well, people usually think the north of Spain is Barcelona, but that's about 1,000 kilometres away. We're on the Atlantic coast, direct south from Ireland, you could say. No?
Okay. So
in the middle of the north coast.
Yeah. So not too far, say, from where the ferry goes from Plymouth to Santander. A lot of people would have been on that ferry.
Yeah, we're 200 kilometres west of Santander.
Okay. And what kind of city is Gijon?
What kind of city?
Yeah.
Well, it used to be very industrial. The provincial capital is Oviedo, as you probably know yourself.
Yep.
And Gijon was always more of an industrial city with shipbuilding, steelworks, a lot of ancillary industries around steel. But those are the old kind of industries which are dying out all over the Western world at the moment. No? So
correct.
Shipbuilding is gone.
Yeah.
And the steel industry is still here. It's been bought up by Arcelor.
An Indian company, right?
Or Mittal Steel.
Yeah.
And so they're carrying on. But lots of small manufacturing companies have closed down. And of course there was coal mining also in the region, and there's a coal mine just outside Gijon which is also closed down in La Camocha. Conversion.
It's beginning to sound a little bit like the northeast of England, kind of Newcastle, Tyneside, that kind of a place.
Yeah, like the northeast, or a bit like Liverpool also.
Okay.
For many years, Asturias, the province, was a European Priority 1 region, receiving lots of funding to reconvert to other types of activity.
So how long have you been there, and what brought you there in the first place?
That's a long story. The two of us, Maureen and I, were working in France. I was there for 6 years, and that's where we met. Teaching English, of course, in France. I should have been a French and or German teacher in the UK, but I decided very early on that wasn't very logical, that I'd be better off teaching English in France instead of French in England.
Yeah.
And the last place I was working in France, in Lyon, I was offered a post as head of a department of a new language school that was setting up here in Spain, in Gijon. Mm-hmm. And so we came along to have a look at it, and we thought, okay, we'll give it a try for a year. We could always go back to France. But we saw that Gijon was developing, changing, and decided to stay.
Okay.
People often ask the same question, how long have you been here? So, well, since 1969, that makes 48 years. But we're thinking of staying. No?
Okay. So when and why did Lawton School come into being? And what's been the trajectory of the business since those early days?
Well, it came into being because the place where we started to work, the partners fell out amongst themselves, and they sold the place to new partners, and we fell out with the new partners. And decided to, as we'd already invested a couple of years of our lives in Spain, we decided to go it alone. That was in 1973 that we started up. Yeah. And since then, we've just continued growing, right?
Okay, so the things you did in the early days and the things you do now, what's the difference, the contrast? What's been the evolution over the period?
When we first came, the idea of the people who set up the school we worked for here at the beginning, their idea was it was going to be an Alliance Française, French school, with a bit of English tagged on, right?
Yeah.
But for one reason or another, it was a time when everything changed in Spain. It was the end of the Franco years, and Spain was beginning to be a bit more outward-looking, and it turned out that people didn't enroll for French as much as people expected, as the partners expected, and so 80% of the students came for English instead, and that has been the same ever since. Some schools still teach French, but the same as the rest of Europe now, English is first foreign language. Yeah.
Yeah. So you saw English overtake Spain in the lifetime of your business. Excuse me, you saw English overtake French as
That's
the
right.
preferred second language in Spain in the lifetime of your business.
Okay, yeah, that's right.
Okay.
We still get older people coming along for classes, and of course, if they're over 45 or 50, usually what they studied at school was French. But nobody ever comes along now, let's say 20 years old or so, saying that, no, my problem is that I did French at school. They all did English at school.
Yeah. And when the business started in those early days, what obstacles did you encounter and what resources did you tap into to overcome those obstacles?
Obstacles, not many really, except the typical obstacles of any new business with the competition. There were other language schools around. Mm-hmm. The resources were basically that we had more know-how. We knew about audiovisual methods. That was another thing that was changing. The teaching methods at that time, the early 70s, teaching methods were changing, and we were more up-to-date with that kind of thing than other people.
Mm-hmm. And over the years, because we're talking over 40 years now, so what were the major pivot points in the business, times when you had to change direction or you took advantage of new opportunities or you were able to avoid threats that were coming down your way?
Well, the town expanded. New building further out from the centre. Traditionally, Spanish people have always liked to live near the centre of the city, but that has changed over the last number of years, and that was one of the first things. Let's say in the mid 80s, late 80s, people began to move away from the centre to new new housing developments around the park or even outside the centre completely. And so we began to notice a drop-off in students, especially children. The parents weren't willing anymore to send their children into the centre for classes, so we had to go to them. So we ended up setting up 2 other branches further out from the centre to cater for that business. That was one of the big events.
Mm-hmm.
Then, of course, there's technology. There's been a lot of technological development over the years. When I said audiovisual, I meant at the beginning slide projectors, using a film strip in a slide projector, and a big old reel-to-reel tape recorder. That moved on to cassettes. Cassettes moved on to CDs. From CDs, we moved on to iPods. And at the moment, we're moving on to using tablets in the classroom for all the sound recordings.
Yeah. And then at some point, you became involved in EU projects. Tell me a little bit about those.
That happened, we started, the first one was, I think, 1997, the first one we did. You could say, well, what's that got to do with languages? Let's say that we are known as a language school, but we've always insisted that what we do is training. And we've developed, we also ran secretarial courses, for example, bilingual secretarial courses, because of the bilingual content. And so the European projects, they came along, and some of them have had more of a purely language content than others. The very first one was rural tourism in 1997. We joined that because it was there, and it was a form of training. And so a clear example of a purely language-based European project was the one called Eurochance. Eurochance, which was vocational English, German, Italian and Spanish online for the visually impaired and the blind.
Mm-hmm.
That was a big challenge where we were responsible for developing all the content, which was a bit of a challenge because obviously blind people can't see the screen, so you've got to think of other solutions.
Yeah. And picking up on the training theme, looking at businesses, why do you think it's important for businesses to invest in language skills? And maybe let me give you 2 kind of types of business, and maybe you can talk about both. So one might be, say, a multinational business looking to develop global executives that they can rotate around the world as they build their career. And then the other, something that's very topical here in Ireland at the moment, say an SME exporter in an English-speaking country, be it Ireland, UK or the USA, looking to trade or looking to set up distribution and manufacturing operations in a non-English-speaking country. So those 2 types of organisations very differently. Why is language learning and language competence important for those, would you say?
I think it's pretty well known and well accepted that if you're trying to sell a product, you need to speak the buyer's language. You need to be able to express something in the buyer's language, apart from all the cultural differences which you have to be aware of, like who speaks first in a meeting with the Japanese, and how do you begin by telling jokes? Mm-hmm. Well, if you're from the Anglosphere, to use a word that you enjoy, if you're from the Anglosphere and you go to a meeting in Japan, you're not going to start off by telling jokes, which you might do if you're English and you're on a trip to Dublin, or vice versa. No?
Yeah, exactly.
So there's the cultural dimension. And if you can get by in the foreign language, then great. But at least make an effort to say something basic. And then What's important is that if you can't speak the foreign language proficiently, then at least make sure that that your version of English is going to be the kind of English that people have invested heavily in as regards time and money in other countries. You need to speak with a neutral kind of accent as far as possible, neutral vocabulary, cut out idiomatic expressions like "Bob's your uncle." People say, "What? Bob's not my uncle." What do you mean?
Yeah. So now you're talking about native English-speaking executives trying to do business with foreigners who have learned English as a second language, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
The native speaker needs to adjust to the kind of English that the foreigners have learnt. And then if it's a question of working in the country, if you're working for a company which has set up a branch somewhere, then you will probably make an effort to acquire the language pretty quickly, or just assimilate the language. If it's one like our son who's in Portugal, did he speak Portugal when he went to Portugal? No. But because he's bilingual, English and Spanish, and can speak French as well, then after a few months he was able to get by pretty well in Portuguese, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's that aspect.
So for businesses in the English-speaking world, which languages do you foresee in the future as being significant for them to build competence in as they look out to world, like we've a globalized economy now, people setting up distribution, manufacturing operations around the world. Which languages do you think for English speakers English-speaking businesses now should be priority?
Well, obviously, it depends which countries you're targeting. But if you haven't got a specific target, then the most useful universally is probably going to be Spanish. Because, Spanish people say there are 500 million people who speak Spanish. I don't know whether that figure is correct or not. They used to talk about 350 million. So in the last 10 years, it's gone up 150 million, which sounds a bit steep. But anyway.
Well, Mexico alone now has about 130 million people in it, and it used to be an awful lot less. I remember looking at the figures back in the 80s, and it was, I don't remember exactly, but maybe only 50, 60 million.
Yeah. The figure is a bit skewed in the sense that there are countries like Paraguay and Peru where they speak other languages like Quechua and Guarani. Yeah. They got co-official languages, and they speak Spanish, but not necessarily so. No. May not be their first language. Yeah. But then, on the other hand, if you're going to be dealing exclusively with Japan, China, or Russia, then Spanish will not necessarily be very useful. No?
Correct.
So, as I say, if it's a general feeling that you need to get out there and work with foreign countries, then first choice would be Spanish, but there might be second choices, Spanish and German or Spanish, because German, of course, would give you access to lots of people lots of executive type people in Eastern Europe, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, where they've had experience of German for one reason or another.
Correct.
But,
and what's your view on French? President Macron, in the last number of days, has been pushing for French to become more of a priority language in the EU with Brexit coming down the line, and also with the development of the African countries and their economies. Do you see French making a comeback?
They'd be lucky if they don't lose out more than they have done. They'll be making a bit of a comeback maybe, but not very much. This is a battle that's been going on since the end of the Second World War, really. that up until the Second World War, French was the language of diplomacy and culture and so on. And this is what was left over. This was the idea that older people had in Spain in the 60s and 70s. That they had the idea that French was the language of international communication, diplomacy, etc. But because of the Second World War and the influence of America, English has taken over, and at the same time, the publishers or developers of teaching materials in the Anglosphere have been a lot more active than the French. And so the French have lost out over the years. They developed audiovisual methods in the first place, but they were overtaken by the big publishing companies in Britain who talked about the communicative approach and the notional functional approach. And the French have remained rather static as regards exporting their product, their language. No?
Yeah. And outside of those big European languages, Spanish, German, French, and so on, which other maybe more exotic languages do you think might be relevant in the future for businesses?
Well, Chinese, yeah. Chinese, everybody says that China is the future, and they seem to be showing that at the moment.
Yep.
But there is a misconception there also. Lots of people embark on Chinese courses and give up pretty quickly. You need quite a lot of immersion in Chinese. The spoken language is not too difficult, but obviously with the ideograms,
yeah,
it's difficult. Yeah.
That kind of brings us then maybe to a kind of a technical consideration, talking about language competence. So how is language competence defined? How is it broken down or deconstructed, and how is it measured?
Well, you've got four basic competences when you talk about knowing a language. You've got four basic competences. You got spoken expression and written expression, understanding when you're listening and understanding when you're reading, right?
Yeah.
So something like Chinese, spoken expression and listening, understanding may be okay, but writing and reading are going to be a problem. Right?
Yeah.
They're a problem even for the Chinese, no? Reading and writing. So that's one breakdown of four basic competences. Sometimes people say there's a fifth basic competence, which is the ability to translate backwards and forwards. The fact that somebody can speak French fluently doesn't necessarily mean that they can translate into their own language. No.
Yeah, it's a very tiring thing, translating.
Yeah, interpreters they get tired towards the end of the day. It happens very often that the English businessman says to the interpreter, "Tell him that our products are the best quality and have 1.5 micron of chrome." So you turn to the French guy and you say, "He says that their products," and you tell the French guy in English, who looks at you. You forget to switch languages sometimes.
Yeah. Tell me then how. Sorry, go ahead.
Patrick,
go ahead.
The other aspect of what you're asking about classification of competences.
Yeah.
You know that there is the Common European Framework of Reference, which was developed by the Council of Europe.
CEFR, is it?
That's the CEFR, which was developed quite a long time ago, and nobody really bothered about it until the European Union took over the promotion of it in order to consolidate or homogenize language competences throughout the Union. And so there they've got classification of which goes from A up through C. A1 would be basic beginner, hello, what's your name, goodbye, and A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, and C2 would be a complete proficiency equivalent to an educated native. Yeah. And more and more, as you were talking about companies, more and more companies are asking for sort of a proof of a good intermediate level as minimum, and they're asking for B2 level. And many companies, universities also.
Mm-hmm. So what's going on here at the moment? So one of the mitigation measures underway here in Irish business, exporting SMEs in particular, and this is a lot of it is in response to the uncertainty of Brexit, is to diversify their export markets and to set up operations in foreign countries, non-English speaking countries. In terms of Lawton Idiomas, which is I think the name of the business, or Lawton School, what services could you provide to Irish businesses, perhaps particularly when they're looking at maybe the Spanish and Portuguese speaking world in Iberia and Latin America?
Well, we run Spanish courses. We run Spanish courses here. We've got a few Japanese people at the moment. Not long ago, we had a group of Lithuanians. We've got private people who happen to be in Gijon, private individuals who come along to us for Spanish. And so we run courses usually on demand, and so class-based courses, but then also because of what we were saying about technology is moving along very fast. And so we're also in a position to do online courses and courses using Skype or other video conferencing software, which we're using for English at the moment, and we can easily use the same kind of software for Spanish or any other language. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. So if people want to contact you, where can they find you, and where can they find out more about the services that you can provide to them?
Well, we've got the web page, of course, lawtonschool.com, www.lawtonschool.com, Lawton School all in small letters and no spaces.
And email?
And sorry, what?
Email?
Email is, the general email for the school would be lawtonschool@lawtonschool.com.
Okay, lawtonschool@lawtonschool.com.
Yeah.
So as we come to the end, Eddie, maybe something a bit more relaxed. In terms of good books that you've been reading in the last year or so, is there one that might stand out that you'd like to mention?
No, I try to read as much as possible, but don't really get too much time. I've just started reading a book that I picked up in an airport, The Hidden Life of Trees,
Okay.
which I picked up because it reminded me of a book I read a long time ago called The Secret Life of Plants.
Okay.
The Hidden Life of Trees by a German guy. I've just finished reading also John Grisham, The Grey Mountain. That's typical Grisham, lawyers battling against big companies and so on. And Girl on a Train, which I read through quickly at the weekend, about three women drunks in the suburbs of London. Not really very interesting.
Okay. Thanks very much for being with us, Eddie, this afternoon. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, it's a pleasure. Me too, yeah.
Wish you every success for the future with your business.
This show was sponsored by Harris Myers, your sales and marketing agency, helping you develop a better sales and marketing pipeline.